Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you for joining us for today's launch of Ensuring the Adequacy of Funding for Decommissioning and Radioactive Waste Management. People from around the world are participating in this event. To ensure a stable connection, and considering the large number of attendees, your video and audio functions have been disabled. You can still actively participate in the discussion by expressing your views, sending us your comments, and asking questions using the Q&A feature. Please note that we may not have enough time to take all of the questions, but we will do our best. Finally, today's discussion is being recorded and will be made available online in the near future. It is now my pleasure to give the floor to the Director General of the NEA, William D. Macwood IV.
Thank you, and welcome to all of you to this very important discussion regarding the ensuring the adequacy of funding of decommissioning and radioactive waste. As you heard, I'm Bill Magwood. I'm Director General of the Nuclear Energy Agency, and my job today is to provide a little context. This is a very important issue because we're at the threshold of a new consideration across the world to use nuclear energy to deal with the threat of climate change, along with other energy forms. This is a time of great uncertainty because we have new technologies that are being introduced. We have the idea of building new nuclear plants. But in order to be able to proceed along those lines, we have to show that we know how to deal with the back end of our fuel cycle, with the decommissioning and radioactive waste. Because as I go around the world, I find that the biggest question that people often raise is, how are we going to deal with these old facilities, and how are we going to deal with radioactive waste? Even in countries that are building new plants, there's a need to deal with decommissioning in an adequate way. And the fact that there seems to be some uncertainty in the minds of the public and some policymakers about this is a reason why this report was created. This report's a product of our Nuclear Development Committee, more specifically the Working Party on Nuclear Energy Economics. And this is a group that comes together to look at these very long-range, important economic issues related to the operation of nuclear power plants. The report comes at a time when we are having this new consideration of nuclear energy, but we also are looking at new ways of thinking about decommissioning. And that's why this report, I think, is so interesting. We now have a very clear methodology that's been used around the world for many years to analyze the cost of decommissioning. So it's a very standard approach that uses economic factors, the planned lifetime of nuclear facilities to calculate what the cost of decommissioning a nuclear power plant will be. Unfortunately, in many countries around the world, we've seen that these numbers have changed quite dramatically. In fact, in some countries, multiple times increased in costs. And that's not because we were wrong about the technical aspects of decommissioning these facilities, but what happened was that circumstances changed during those decommissioning activities. In the old days, it was very well understood that nuclear power plants in most places would be shut down, the fuel removed, any risk completely eliminated, and a plant would sit for some number of years, perhaps even 50 years before being decommissioned. There were very good technical reasons to do that, very good safety reasons to do that, and very good cost reasons to do that. And in many countries, that was a basic assumption. But times change. The public expectations have changed. And most of these projects are now being decommissioned much more promptly. The rules are changing. Now, not only the rules are changing, but the technologies are changing. So the old model that we have for decommissioning these plants, this old linear model, as we call it, is a very good place to start, but it's not necessarily reflective of reality. What we have found is that there's a very complex system that you're going to learn about during this webinar that we reflect in what we call the circular approach. And this is the idea that's being promoted by this report. The circular approach is triggered by the idea that the framework around decommissioning responds to a variety of different factors, including political decisions and changes in social perspectives. And it's important that the decommissioning estimates evolve and change along with these new understandings. Recognition that that there are new developments that will come along the way that will influence the outcome of the cost, and we have to reflect that. Now, what we have found so far in looking around the world, and you're going to hear about the case studies associated with this report, is that we believe that nuclear plant decommissioning in NEA countries is adequately funded, that we have set aside the resources, or the resources will be available to make sure that these plants can be deactivated and decommissioned and the sites remediated as appropriate. However, this is a good time to take a look at the longer term. And this report looks at the possibility of having a much more holistic view of decommissioning estimates. And that brings up this circular approach that takes into these other factors into consideration, not just in decommissioning, but also in radioactive waste management. The circular approach applies a viewpoint that these changes in society have to be in some way accommodated. And this is not necessarily completely new, because as we went through our case studies, we discovered that these factors have been incorporated in some fashion in decommissioning and radioactive waste management activities around the world in various countries. You'll hear more about that. So we're very pleased to talk with you about this today. I think you'll find this conversation to be most interesting and most enlightening. And I very much want to recognize all the people who contributed to this report, particularly the primary authors, Dr. Jan Horst Keppler, the NEA chief economist, who you will be hearing from in just a few minutes, Mr. Lucas Neer, an analyst with the NEA, and the head of division, Deanne Cameron, who will be moderating the discussion. Following the overview and findings of the report that Mr. Keppler will provide, we'll proceed to a panel discussion, and Deanne will introduce the panelists one after another. So I hope you enjoy this conversation today. I hope you find it enlightening and interesting. And I do hope that it gives you greater confidence that we do have adequate funding for nuclear decommissioning and radioactive waste management activities, but that we can also do even better in the future. So with that, I wish you all a good next several minutes listening to this important discussion, and look forward to the questions that will come over the course of the next hour. So with that, I hand the floor to Deanne. Deanne?
Thank you, Director General Magwood, for those great opening remarks. I won't waste any further any of this precious time. Let's dive right in. It's my pleasure to invite our chief economist, Jan Horst Keppler, to present the report's main findings. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Jan. Thank you, Bill. It's a great pleasure to present this report today. I will actually share my screen and then show you a number of slides. Yes, ensuring the adequacy of funding arrangements for decommissioning and radioactive waste management. This report has been in gestation for quite a while, and quite a number of people have contributed to it. Bill has already mentioned some of them. There have been the NTE division heads who have always supported that. There have been other than Lucas, who has been very helpful indeed. Also Paul Etienne Pini and Jan-Henrik Kruse, long-term interns, junior analysts, consultants who have done a great work, especially on the country case studies. Rebecca Tedeschi has always supported us, even if it's not work in her division, but of course they are the experts on radioactive waste management. And Andrew McIntyre and his team have really helped us getting this over the line in the last few days and weeks. A great many thanks to the representatives of the member countries who really have helped us more than usually is the case on the country case studies. I'll run them through very quickly. Chantal Cotfrin from Belgium was here today, Puwa Yuen from Canada, Roger Lundmark from Switzerland, Jorma Aurela from Finland, Benoit Lepouzet from France, Fernando Oster from Germany, who's also here, Yuna Gai from Japan, Mr. Shin from Korea, Jesus Tadon Silvestre from Spain, Peter Stolz from Sweden, Glenn Bowen from the United Kingdom, and Bill McCaughey, who's also here with us from the United States. So these have really helped us a lot. The NEA committees, the NDC that has been mentioned with its chair Patrick Lehrman, and the WPNE with William Dassler have of course overseen this work, and our colleagues from the European Commission and from the IAEA have been very, very helpful, in particular in the seminars and the workshops that we organized. So a great many thanks to all of them. Coming to the report itself, I'd like to sort of give you a little bit an overview of the spirit in which we approach that. The aim is to broaden and deepen the conversation, not to supplant existing approaches, and as has been said, overall funding arrangements in NEA member countries, both for decommissioning and radioactive waste management, are sound. Much good work is also being done, adaptations on the ground. However, and that's where this report comes in, only some of them are actually covered by the existing conceptual approaches. The ADEC report provides elements of a broader framework that allows integrating a number of challenges already taking place. And so our objective is to provide a framework for pertinent policy discussions that organize politically, financially, and financially sustainable trade-offs, and we aim at enabling a broader set of policy options rather than to provide prescriptive solutions. 5 key points. Ensuring adequacy of funding is a long-term issue subject to socio-political, technological, and economic change. One size does not fit all, i.e. national specificities can have large impacts in this area. That's a very important point in this area. Risks should always be borne by the party that best equipped to understand, reduce, and manage those risks. That's a tenet of an area of economics called law and economics that guided us throughout the work. That's especially important if you talk about something that non-diversifiable risk, which cannot really be hedged by private actors in markets. Then technological solutions can change, also in radioactive waste management. Interim storage must be part of any long-term solution, and waiting sometimes can confer additional optional value. DG Magwood mentioned that. And finally, we say that we should adopt a circular approach in which all parameters of the system are realigned based on a broad discussion with stakeholders, at regular pre-announced intervals. Context and structure. To some extent, these are challenges that are inevitable. We haven't chosen them, but they're here and we have to deal with them. The nuclear power reactor fleet is aging. More than 190 power reactors have already been shut down today. And there are increasing amounts of radioactive waste that require to be dealt with in a sustainable solution. And there is a fundamental conviction driving our work that the key issue in preparing for decommissioning high-level radioactive waste management, the key issue is not technical feasibility. It's financial adequacy, but that in return, and that I think is a key point, depends on the political sustainability of the processes in place, the frameworks, and the choices. The report has a 3-part structure: conceptual framework, which I will talk about, 12 country case studies from, you have seen them, Belgium, Canada, Finland, France, Germany, Japan, Korea, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, UK, United Kingdom, and the United States. And we conclude with some elements of good policy practice. This is already also a good moment to rethink the adequacy of financing right now. First of all, disbursement is approaching. Funding challenges are no longer hypothetical. They are have to be dealt with, so to say, in the real world. There is a lack of certainty concerning politically sustainable radioactive waste management solutions, and that can hamper nuclear development. And finally, macroeconomic environment. We have challenges from the macroeconomic environment, in particular, very low interest rates on invested funds. And that challenges the central assumptions of current funding systems. Next slide, please. Very good. This is an overview of the conceptual framework, the new look based on this law and economics approach, the linear to a circular approach that was already mentioned. I'll come to that in a minute. We'll also be talking briefly about the polluter pays principle that needs to be approached in a somewhat broader perspective than what is usually the case. We have an overview of funding forms, investment strategies, and cost estimations. And that indeed is something that I will not talk about today. It's more informational, but you'll find it in the report. If you can go to the next slide, we can jump right in with that distinction between a linear to a circular approach. The linear approach is what you're all familiar with. You have a solution, you estimate a cost, you set a date sometimes in the future, and you discount that cost down to today to a net present value. And that's the amount of funds that you need to have, of course, allowing for any returns you'll make on the investment of those funds. And that has been a useful starting point for establishing funding systems. However, they're based on this somewhat strong assumptions, very strong assumptions that key parameters such as technologies, their costs, the discount rate, the return on capital, and also the operating lifetimes of nuclear power plants will remain stable for several decades. I'll appreciate that that's only the case in the most rarest of circumstances. Instead, we advocate a circular approach in which all key parameters can change in a fashion where causal relationships can be bidirectional, which is not the case in the linear approach where you discount from a given cost number. And that if one of the elements in the system changes, all the other elements in the system need to adapt. Once more, some of these things are already happening. If you look at member countries, and you'll find that in the country case studies, but it's not conceptualized in that way if you look at the general frameworks. The next slide, please, which will spell out a little bit what we mean by this circular approach, what are its key elements. First of all, this idea of interdependence and bidirectional causalities. A change in one parameter might require the adaptation of all other parameters. So the question that we have asked and are asking habitually is no longer only, are my current assets A and my future expected revenues B adequate to finance my best estimate of cost C? But the question becomes rather, what is a sustainable process involving all stakeholders to adjust A and B when C changes? Or even A and B have changed. Are there any options available to bring C in line? So broader set of questions, broader set of adaptations that are possible. Cost estimates in that approach are endogenous. It's not an objective exogenous number, but costs do depend on political, regulatory, and technical choices. This holds even if there's broad consensus for a given category of solutions, such as deep geological repositories. Technical specifications, size, location, geological environment, so on and so forth, have an enormous impact on costs. So costs are endogenous, not exogenous. Adaptability, we mentioned that all elements must be adaptable. And prepare for the possibility of discontinuous change. Technology, politics, can induce indeed discontinuous change that would require radical adaptations outside of initial assumptions. And prepare for regular revisions with broad stakeholder involvement. That does not mean continuous uncertainty. Revisions should take place at regular intervals that are specified in advance, legitimated by appropriate democratic processes, and should involve all stakeholders. With that, we'll move on to the next slide to have a little bit a spotlight on this important question of discounting. Discount rate, risk, return on capital. We use them in this context rather interchangeably, although in reality there might be differences, but let's talk about discount rates. And you know that they are hugely important, but I want to underline how decisive they are, together with the date of timing, of course, with the date at which a DGR or other solution would indeed be implemented. You have here in the upper left-hand corner, you would have a solution in place that would cost 10 billion, 10 years from now, discount rate 0, and you are indeed at an annuity that you would have to generate from your assessed contributions at 1 billion per year. Now, if you are at 5% discount rate and you move out to 2100, then you're not 10% of that number. You're at 1% of that number. Factor 100, you're at 10 million. So the differences are huge in terms of timing, in terms of the discount rate. Now you will say, well, there you took a wide range of discount rates, and then it's obvious that you get a wide range of results for the annuities. But let's look at the next slide. And you will see the discount rate assumptions of several European countries, report by the European Commission of 2016, so after the financial crisis, economic and financial crisis. And looking at the real discount rate, taking the nominal discount rate assumed, and deducting the inflation rate, the assumed inflation rate, you go from minus 0.9 to 2.6. Countries rather close, rather being ruled by the same set of rules, expecting the same economic growth by and large. So you see that there is a huge amount of uncertainty, which makes it very, very difficult to sort of apply the linear approach with a great deal of confidence. We have an additional challenge that the long-term financial outlook predict all very low or even negative returns on low-risk assets. Those low-risk assets are preferred by regulators and politicians, and rightly so, for very good reasons. And these very low rates may require to either increase funding requirements and raise assessed contributions, postpone long-term solutions to radioactive waste management, or resort to less costly solutions, implement riskier investment strategies, which on average have higher returns, but that means that they are more risky. That needs to be communicated. Somebody must be there who can take on these risks if those higher returns shouldn't materialize, even if on average they do. And finally, we have a new issue that we'll not go into today, but in terms of investing these funds, ESG criteria, environmental, social, and governance criteria, do play an increasing role in the discussions in a number of member countries. We can move on to the next slide, please. Yes, that's the next big point that we want to sort of communicate with that study, with that report, and also in this presentation, a broader reading of the polluter pays principle. The polluter pays principle is a classic, PIGU 1920, OECD 1972, and in the nuclear field, it's usually understood to mean that the operators of nuclear power plants and their customers are liable for the costs of decommissioning and radioactive waste management. The PPP has served the nuclear community well. It will continue also to do so when approached in a broader perspective. And its basic premise that we want to maximize welfare through cost minimization will continue to hold. However, this simple reading of the PPP is based on a number of assumptions that do not fully apply in the context, in particular, of radioactive waste management, but DG Magwood also underlined they may not hold in the area of decommissioning either. First of all, they assume a partial equilibrium framework. Parameters are stable, well known to all stakeholders. The cost of damages are known ex ante, and the polluter has control over the costs. technologies that determine the cost of internalization are fixed. It also assumes substitutability at the margin between private costs and social costs, so social benefits. The PPP will not handle discontinuous changes. In the next slide, we'll elaborate that a little bit. Costs are not controlled by the nuclear operators, i.e. the costs of the solutions to be implemented. These choices are incumbent on governments, regular bodies, or specific processes. There's no substitutability between private and social costs due to the radically different politically determined technical options. The marginal logic no longer holds. You cannot optimize your output, electricity production, and the technology, which would mean kilograms of waste per megawatt hour, to arbitrage between private benefits, which would be the electricity prices, and the social costs, the discounted costs of radioactive waste management. You see that it doesn't work that way in nuclear power production. The equivalence of defined contribution, discounted future costs, is thus very difficult to establish and impossible for the polluter, for the operator of the nuclear power plant. Let's recall the general principle on which we operate: allocate liability to the party best equipped to minimize and manage the risks and their costs. That should also be the party that chooses between different technological and political options and to determine timing. And in the fields we're talking about, only government has a legitimacy and ability to set parameters for radioactive waste management and decommissioning and to organize these trade-offs. Hence, the most efficient solution would be for it to assume also the corresponding legal liability and financial responsibility. Any transfer of responsibilities will need to be accompanied by concomitant transfers of the accrued funds and the rights to future revenue streams, as well as, depending on circumstances, any additional payments. I'll come to my last two slides. I'll go through them in the interest of time very, very quickly. Just running by you some elements of the good policy practice that we have identified, both on the basis of the conceptual framework and on the basis of the country case studies. Once more, these solutions need to respond to the specific situation of each country. It's a long-term issue, which is subject to significant change. We advocate a circular approach in which all elements of the system can be adapted at regular intervals. Liabilities should always be assumed by the party best equipped to handle them. And prepare for radical uncertainty, discontinuous change. That always requires some form of public participation, either implicitly or better, explicitly and in advance. And we'll come to the last slide. We think in the report, but that's something to be discussed and very much depending on the situation in the member countries, that there is at the current stage of knowledge and technology a distinction between decommissioning and radioactive waste management. Decommissioning in some countries is becoming an almost mature industrial activity, and that thus funding decommissioning would thus be expected to remain the responsibility of operators. And despite the fact that the first DGR will become operational in a few years, radioactive waste management is likely to rely on bespoke solutions defined according to specific national needs and evolving societal and politically expressed preferences. Financial liability arrangements need to be robust over the long term. That requires, in many cases, a broader interpretation of the polluter pays principles. Remember, important part of the PPP, also the best party placed to implement the solution should have the responsibility. That's usually not the nuclear utility and the customers. So governments, as the stewards of societal preferences, determine the technologies, timing, and location of radioactive management solutions, they should also be the ultimate bearers of residual risks. Transfer of liabilities, as has been said, needs to be accompanied by a transfer of constituted funds. Finally, that's my final word, transitioning from a linear to a circular approach recognizes explicitly that ensuring the adequacy of funding for decommissioning and radioactive waste management is not akin to traditional project finance, which we suppose in the linear approach or in the PPP, but it's a dynamic societal process that requires multiple adjustments along the way. I thank you for your attention. Back to you, Diane.
Thank you so much, Dr. Keppler. Our ability to credibly demonstrate and communicate long-term solutions, including the financial plans as you have set out in this adaptive and circular approach for decommissioning and waste management, is so key to building public confidence in nuclear energy. You've given us a lot to think about. And now I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel to reflect on what we've heard today. I'll take a moment to introduce each of our panelists in turn and invite them to turn their cameras on, and then we'll get to the questions. First is Ms. Chantal Kortwind, advisor of Federal Public Service Economy, SMEs, Middle Classes, and Energy in Belgium. Ms. Kortwind is an economist with more than 20 years of experience working in the Belgian Federal Public Service and Energy Administration on nuclear topics. Since 2003, she has handled issues such as financing arrangements for decommissioning and radioactive waste management. She is also the secretary of the Belgian Nuclear Provisions Committee. Ms. Kortwind has contributed in many working groups on this topic on a national and European level. You are invited to turn your camera on. And now I'll introduce our second panelist, the acting director of the Office of Advanced Fuels and Technologies in the United States Department of Energy, Office of Nuclear Energy, Mr. Bill McCaughey. Mr. McCaughey oversees the accident-tolerant fuel program for existing commercial light water reactors and advanced fuels for future advanced reactors. He also oversees the high-assay, low-enriched uranium availability program and systems analysis and integration activities for future nuclear fuel cycles. Mr. McCaughey has been with the Office of Nuclear Energy for 14 years. You are also invited to turn your camera on. Our third panelist is Mr. Jean Lefebvre, Director of the Asset Liability Management Division at Électricité de France, EDF. Mr. Lefebvre is responsible for providing financial guidelines for liabilities such as nuclear and pension provisions, strategic allocation or investment guidelines for hedging assets to cover those provisions, strategic net debt management guidelines, financial criteria for new operational investments, and is in charge of the EDF Group's financial result controlling. Mr. Lefebvre is CEO and company director of several financial subsidiaries of the EDF Group. You are invited to turn your camera on, Mr. Lefebvre. And our fourth panelist is Dr. Fernando Oster. Dr. Oster works as a policy officer in the Division of Nuclear Energy in the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy in Germany. He holds a degree in physics from the University of Heidelberg and a PhD in energy economics from the Technical University of Berlin. Before joining the Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy, he worked as a research associate in the Department of Energy Systems at the Technical University of Berlin. You're well invited to turn your camera on. Last, but certainly not least, I would like to welcome the head of Division of Radioactive Waste Management and Decommissioning at the NEA, Ms. Rebecca Tedeschi. Ms. Tedeschi joined the NEA in January 2019 and is responsible for advancing information exchange and studies in the field of radioactive waste management, nuclear facility decommissioning, and legacy management. Prior to joining the NEA, Ms. Tedeschi served as the chief of the Radiation Protection Branch in the Office of Nuclear Regulatory Research at the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission. She has over 27 years of domestic and international experience in operations and radiation safety of research reactors, fuel fabrication facilities, nuclear power plants, and biomedical research facilities. Ms. Tedeschi, you're welcome to turn your camera on. We should now have all of our panelists on camera. And I'd like to now pose a series of questions to our panelists, and I'll invite each of you in turn to answer the questions. So let's go first with our first question for each of you. What is the biggest challenge in ensuring adequacy of financing arrangements, starting with Ms. Chantal Courtevindt?
So the biggest challenge for me is a combination of the time aspect and the uncertainties that are in the picture for these decommissioning and radioactive waste management. As this all takes a long time, it's difficult to foresee the future. There are technical, economical, social developments, as Jan already said, and we don't know what the future will bring. So what techniques will be available? Will the companies that are responsible, the so-called polluters, will they be available? Will they be around? Will they still exist? If the government has to take over some of the responsibilities, of course, with payment of the funds that accompany it, what is the right time to do it? At what point can we say that we are sure that this is a good moment? And also, the second element is the uncertainty. We don't know what techniques will be available. Some solutions for radioactive waste management are available. Some still needs to be built. And this will take some time, even some decades. And will the funds that were set aside, will they still be available, and will they be enough? So for me, it's a combination of the time and the uncertainty that are the biggest challenges for all of us.
Thank you. Those are indeed big challenges. Mr. Bill McCaughey, your view on the biggest challenges.
Well, thank you. So in the United States, for decommissioning, the reactor operators are responsible for ensuring adequate funding. And the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission maintains the rules that the operators have to follow. Things like mandatory reports, financial certifications, starting at the operating license stage, and then annual adjustments. There are rules on the types of financial assurances allowed, and cost estimates starting 5 years before the end of operations are required. Overall, the processes are in place and are working well to ensure that decommissioning funds are available when they're needed. For the radioactive waste management, spent fuel, it's a different arrangement. The funding, the US government is responsible for disposing of the spent nuclear fuel and high-level waste, and funding comes from fees based on the electricity produced by the nuclear plants. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act was enacted and sets the rules and regulations on funding mechanisms, contracts between the government and the reactor operators. And there, the funding mechanisms in the Nuclear Waste Policy Act had proved to be reasonable and workable. However, in 2014, a US court ordered that the collection of the fee be suspended after the government suspended the repository program at Yucca Mountain, Nevada. And the government now needs to enact an alternative waste disposal plan. So it's so since 2014, we have no nuclear waste funds going in, and we have to await a new plan for waste disposal in the United States.
Thank you. Mr. Jean-Marc Lefebvre.
Yeah, so I would say in a few words that, of course, cost assessment is key. That has been said already, and there is uncertainty both on costs and on assets. So anyway, we need to make regular studies and to adapt to the context, that's for sure. But otherwise, I would say that the biggest challenge in terms of a decision is to target the proper asset allocation that fits for the operator, that takes into account risk-return approach in a consistent manner with the time profile of the costs. And that's a specificity of the subject which has been underlined by several participants. So we are dealing with very long-term costs, and that's of course essential to take into account for the asset allocation. So what we target today, it's public, it's an allocation which is made of 40% growth assets with listed equity, 30% fixed income, and 30% yield assets with infrastructure. So you may endure some volatility in your short-term volatility, but what is very important is to keep the target for the long term.
Thank you. Dr. Oster.
Yeah, thank you very much. So for me, the biggest challenge certainly is to deal with the large amount of uncertainties, which is, I guess, we all agree on here on the panel, in the process due to the very long time frame of almost a century for the final disposal, at least here in Germany, and the associated risk for the taxpayer on that. In 2015, my government set up an independent commission of experts in order to draw up some recommendations and as to how to organize the financing of decommissioning and dismantling of nuclear power plants and for the disposal of nuclear waste. And they said that one of the biggest risks was in 2015, the wholesale prices on electricity markets were quite low and they were struggling. The nuclear power plant operators, and the biggest risk was that they could become insolvent and or try to minimize their liability for the disposal of nuclear waste by restructuring their operations. So this commission worked out some recommendations to reduce those risks, and the experts argued that a consensus could provide greater certainty both for operators and for the public. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Rebecca Tedeschi.
Okay, I mean, I think the issue is when preliminary assessment is done for financial assurance, you have to make a choice in terms of whether it's going to be dismantled immediately, dismantled deferred, or it's going to be entombment. And the factors that are going to impact those are the national policy, regulatory framework, the technical ability, you have the environmental impact, the social impact, and also the knowledge management and human resource in the organization. And some of the biggest challenge is that how do you account as changing environment and changing concerns from the stakeholders, how do you account that in the financial assurance program and continuously modify those things so it's such that you will have the ability to address those concerns. In terms of waste management, I think, except the high-level waste and spent fuel, I think there is a process that has been placed and there's not an issue in terms of disposal. So the uncertainty that we deal with are really specific to those areas and how do you address the changing stakeholder desires as to what the end state should look like for the facilities.
Thank you so much. Collectively, you've all described challenges that are related, that are interwoven. There's a certain a common thread around uncertainty that cuts across all the challenges that you've named. I'd like to go across the panel one more time. I'm going to combine two questions and we'll go down the same line of panelists. With respect to these challenges, which, you know, we want to give you an opportunity to share with us what your country has done to tackle the challenges and mitigate the risks and manage the uncertainties you've identified. And also, at the same time, if you could please comment on how the circular approach that's advocated in the report could help further ensure the long-term sustainability of financing. So we'll just go across one more time in the same order, please. First, Ms. Chantal Courteville.
So the measures that we have taken over the years We started, as you could see in the presentation, there was the example of the linear approach. I think everybody started with a linear approach. It's a good basis, but we do regular reviews of the scenarios for decommissioning and radioactive waste management. There are evaluations of the costs, of the margins. We had in recent years a review, several reviews of the discount rates, because financial markets had changed so much, so it was no longer realistic. And we also review our legal framework from time to time. Changing is not always very fast, but we still are on track to change the legal requirements with the time changing and the electricity market changing. So there was also in the presentation, there were mentioning of ESG requirements. This is something new, so we are also considering those new elements. And although we have a linear approach, we try to take into account as much as we can all the other aspects that are around this exercise. So I think it's not always so straightforward if it is linear or circular. We try to do as much as we can to come to a scenario and a cost calculation that matches the reality.
Thank you. From the US perspective, Bill?
Yes, thank you. So as I said earlier, for the decommissioning process, it is the funding process, the funding mechanisms are quite stable and are working well. On the spent fuel and high-level waste disposal, when the US government suspended the Yucca Mountain project, they established a blue ribbon commission that provided recommendations. And one of the key recommendations was to establish a consent-based siting process. So this was thought to be the key issue in the US on deep geologic disposal is siting, and a consent-based siting process would work best. And so the Department of Energy investigated that in quite some detail with many public sessions across the country. And where we are now is that most of the recommendations of the Blue Ribbon Commission, including that consent-based siting processes, would require new legislation enacted by Congress. And several bills since then have been introduced that contains many of the features of the Blue Ribbon Commission recommendations, but none yet have been enacted into law. So when I look at the study, it resonates well with me, this circular approach. The fact that we need to deal with, I think a term that's been used in this, that was used in the study, is radical uncertainty and discontinuous changes. The process we had prior with the Nuclear Waste Policy Act is being reevaluated and will be changed. And there are many possibilities out there. Deep geologic disposal in other geologic media at other sites. Also, there's other technologies out there for managing the spent fuel and high-level waste. And once decisions are made at a policy level, then we'll have to take action to make sure our funding mechanisms are adequate or reflect that new approach. So that is what's being discussed as the circular approach. You're looking at everything. You're looking at technology options, changes in technology options, changes which will lead to changes in cost estimates, timing, and this circular approach really connects well with what the reality will be in the future for us in the US. I do want to say also that aside from the very good analyses that were done in the study, collecting 12 country case studies in itself is extremely valuable for benchmarking, for best practices, for lessons learned. And I think anyone involved in decommissioning funding or spent nuclear fuel disposal will benefit from this study.
Thank you, Mr. Mercahi. Now, Mr. Lefebvre, your perspectives, please.
Yeah, so I would say a bit, some words about the recent initiatives in France, of course, from EDF's point of view. I would underline 4 items that are all related to the long-term profile of the costs. So one thing was to have the possibility to have more infrastructure in the hedging assets. That's a very important point, as I said earlier. So that's something that where there was progress in the recent years. A second thing is to have more guidelines about the interest rates that may be used for the very long term, especially when you talk about 60 years from now or more. And then there was some progress in the guideline that was given, which is now based on the insurance regulation using the ultimate forward rate. That was something very precious, because when you look at 60 years from now, it's very difficult to base only on the markets to make those kind of estimates. Third thing I would say is to also to be able to endure the short-term volatility, as I said. And for that, we now have the possibility, at least we can ask for it, to wait 5 years before adapting to the context instead of 3 years before. So that's also a good thing, I would say. And then last thing, which is the better consideration now for a long-term issue, which is climate, and that's something which now we take into consideration in our estimates. And as regard the reports, I would say that I fully agree with the circular approach, which is supported there. I would mention 3 points. First is that it allows to take into account local specificities in this issue. And I think it's important to remind for EDF in France, we are characterized by a very much standardized fleet with still a long time to run. And also, as you may know, a well-engaged project for storage, long-term storage of nuclear waste. So it's very important to take into account this kind of specificities. Second, I would say to promote the alignment of responsibilities and decisions in the same actor. I think it's a very important point to optimize the security in the long term. And then I would say the last thing is to adapt constantly to the context that may change, and it all makes a consistent approach.
Thank you. Dr. Oster.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have prepared some slides for the case of Germany. I would appreciate if you could show them. Yes, next slide, please. So, as I had explained before, there was an expert commission of the German government, and they elaborated a solution which was put into practice in 2016. So the utilities, the nuclear power plant operators, would continue to be responsible for the decommissioning and dismantling of the nuclear power plants, as well as for the financing. And the new thing here is that the responsibility for the management and financing for interim and final storage now lies with the government. And for that, an external public fund was created, which is run by highly qualified financial experts, which are there to ensure the financing of interim and final storage. Next slide, please. So I want to talk more about this fund. It's an external public fund. Sometimes we say it's a startup. They started from scratch of approximately 20 finance professionals. The headquarters in Berlin, and the supervisory board consists of members of the government and the parliament, and the legal supervision is carried out by us, the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy. Next slide, please. As Mr. Keppler has explained in his presentation, the polluter pays principle is also valid for Germany, and the utilities invested, the utilities paid around 24 billion euros to the fund, and the goal of the fund is to have a return on investment of approximately 4.6% per year. And interestingly, those 24 billion euros consists of around 17.5 billion euros and a risk surcharge, because the responsibility, the liability now is not in the hands of the utilities anymore, but in the hands of the government. That was a solution found by the Commission to give more certainty both for the operators and for the public. And concerning the linear and the other approach, of course, the linear approach is a very good beginning to start calculating, but the approach in the report somehow reflects more the reality, which we already have experienced here in Germany. So just recently, yes. So just recently,
minutes left for Diane and for Rebecca. Can we go do that?
Yes, so we have adopted a law to improve the legal framework, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. And Rebecca, very briefly, your reflections.
Okay, as you know, NEA has 2 technical committees that supports decommissioning and waste management. And our real goal is to look at, to make sure the cost of decommissioning is adequate, as well as looking at how do we make sure it's an accurate process to go through. And so we try to make sure that we look at a holistic approach. We look at the technical approach, the environmental aspect, and the societal aspect, and the economic aspect. So within our work, the Working Party for Programs, CDLM, has created an opportunity to look at how do we do cost estimate for decommissioning? How do we make sure the uncertainties are being looked at? How do we address the reliability and audibility of that cost estimation? And that needs to be fed back to the financial assurance that is being put in place for new entities. So what I see this report does is that having that circular approach will give it an iterative process that will look at what has been done from previous decommissioning and what are the technologies that have been improved. How do you address the general public's interest? All those factors needs to be considered, and our working parties and both the waste side and the decommissioning side has the potential to provide you those information such that the financing is realistic and also looks at what are the issues right now that stands for DGRs and other waste disposal facilities. And we do believe that we have technologically advanced in development of DGRs. And it is a matter of political and stakeholder decisions that is keeping the activities moving forward. But we see France, Finland, and other countries that are moving forward, and we could address these issues. So I think we have ability to work together and address making sure it's sustainable.
Thank you so much, Ms. Tedeschi. And so I'd like to just thank our distinguished panelists today. as well as the extraordinary team that put together the report. We will run over by 1 minute. I will invite our chief economist at Keppler to make some final remarks, maybe 30 seconds or less, and I will identify for you, Jan, as you're giving your final remarks, two questions that came up in the chat and the Q&A that really are, I think, almost definitional questions, and a question about one of the assumptions. So a definitional question very quickly, to be very clear for everyone, when we're talking about the circular approach here, we are not in fact talking about closing the fuel cycle. We're not talking about recycling. So just a really quick recap of what we're talking about, how it applies to the financial processes. And then here, if you would like to tackle this, there's a bit of a challenge on one of the assumptions. Why is the assertion on risk that the risk should be borne by the party best positioned to manage the risk without further clarification? It's a classic assumption, but on what basis do we make that assumption? And over to you for final remarks.
Yes, thank you very much, Diane. Thank you very much for the panelists. It's been extremely encouraging to listen to you and to see how the questions and the answers that we try to give sort of link in with the issues that you have in your different countries. So that makes the work very much worthwhile. One point that was mentioned by Chantal, there's not always a clear-cut opposition between the linear approach and the circular approach. The two can become quite similar. However, Bill also reminded us that there can be discontinuous change and radical uncertainty, and then indeed the old linear approach in a purely adaptive manner will no longer be sufficient. But it's the starting point on which we all rely. Very quickly on the two questions. Yes, the circular adaptive approach refers to the political and financial sustainability and makes no presumption about the choice of radioactive waste management that is being retained, whether it's the closing of the fuel cycle or a deep geological repository or extended interim storage, leaving the options open. We do not make any technological choice whatsoever with respect to the technical solution retained. The question by Paul Murphy is already sort of going towards the next level, and I'm afraid we're not having time to really discuss it. But the question he asks is, of course, the right one. At what price do we organize this transfer of private liability to public liability? And then, that was mentioned in the case of Germany, do we need any added sort of risk payments that account for any risks that are not yet sort of internalized in the originally constituted funds? Question of uncertainty. And the key question here is fairness. Is really fairness, and that the arrangements are viewed politically and societally as sort of a fair transfer. Once it's done, I think then you should sort of move on towards the next step. But that requires, again, a broad discussion. What is the fair price, accounting for the private costs, which we can assess, of course, with some degree of confidence, and some social costs that are inevitably part of that, and that require a broader societal discussion processes. With that, once again, thank you very much for your contribution. It was a great pleasure working on the report, being with you today on the panel. Diane, final words.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I think we'll draw the session to a close now. There might be a final administrative message from our team.
Thanks very much to our panelists, and thanks very much to all who listened in. We appreciate your participation and would like to invite you to our next event on June 24th. Today's event has been recorded and will be available on the NEA website in the coming days. You can also follow the NEA on Twitter and LinkedIn to keep in touch with us and receive updates on our programs and events like this one. Thank you, and goodbye for now.